Now let's look at grouping and organising our scenes. We had a look at the outliner in the previous session, so let's have a look at this outliner now with a bit more detail. I've set this outliner up so that we've got some spheres, and we're going to create some parent-child relationships to enable us to do some animation at future events. So these are set to be these are set to look like the solar system. So the first thing we should get used to doing is how we would name our objects. So this object at the moment is called sphere 2, but we can see that this needs to be called the backdrop, so we might call this poly backdrop. The sphere 1, that's the sun, so we might want to call this poly sun. Sphere 3, well, this one is, if we just have a quick zoom in, this one's the earth, so this would be poly earth. And then sphere 4 is the moon, so we could call this one poly moon. Okay, so we've now given ourselves a little bit more information inside the outliner by naming these objects, which makes it easier for us to select them and move through them. Now, each of these objects, as you can see, has been created at world 0, and if we bring up the channel box, we can see that they've been moved into the world position that we wanted them at. So this one is at -500 units, this one's at -490 units, the sun is at 0 units, and so is the backdrop. But what if we want to have the earth revolving around the sun? Well, or we want the moon to be revolving around the earth. Well, these are things that we have to then set up and consider. So let's start creating a parent-child relationship. So the easiest way of doing this is to middle mouse drag one of your objects onto another object, and you can see that a little plus icon occurs and we end up with a little chain underneath. So the moon retains its own, if we select the moon, it retains its own world center. But if we were to select the earth now has the moon inside its sphere of influence. So it's going to drive the actions of the moon. So let's say that the moon wants to have its own little rotation. So in here we'll just put this so that there is a keyframe, and we'll get into keyframing, thing like that in much more detail. But there's a keyframe there, and then we want to have 15 degrees of rotation at the end of the key selected frame. So you can see that there's a little bit of movement now just occurring on that moon. But then on the earth we want to do one full rotation in that 120 frames. So let's set a keyframe there for 0, and then at that one we will set this one to 359 degrees. I'm using 359 because then we could set up a loop if we wanted. So 359 degrees, and I'll just key that one as well. So now we can see that the earth is driving the moon's position. So what about if the earth was then to be disconnected from the moon? Well, if we press Shift P, or we just middle mouse drag the moon object out, and we were to then do the rotation, you can see that the animation stays on the moon, but it's not affecting now the it stays on the earth, but it's not affecting the moon object. If we put the moon back in, and oops, let's just bring that again, put the moon back into the earth's influence, then you can see that that's then animated the same way. If we wanted to add the sun to this, so we wanted the sun then, so we wanted the earth to be revolving around the sun, well, we might only want to animate this over, say, 1 degree or 2 degrees. So the moon might have a keyframe there on the rotate axis of 0, and then at frame 120 it'll have a keyframe of 2 degrees. So it's done a little bit of a movement, and then we key selected. So you see there's a little bit of a movement on there, and then we've got the earth spinning away. Let's just turn this so that we can see the earth. We can see the earth spinning away, and the moon's spinning around the earth. And then we want to add this earth object to the sun, so we would select the earth object and the sun object, and if we hit P, then the earth object has moved underneath the sun's influence. So you can now see that the earth is beginning its spin, and we've set up a bit of an animation there that's showing how that would work. So that's a very, very easy way of us organizing our scene. Now let's say we're wanting to make selections in here, but we keep selecting this object in the background, and we don't want to be selecting this object because we're now in animation stage. If we go to our channel box and we look at our display options underneath the layers, we can create some new layers that will help us. So we could create an empty layer. We could call this layer the background, BG for short, and click save. And then we could add the objects that we want to put into this object. So we can go in here and we select the backdrop, and we can go to the layer and we can say that we want to have a look at the membership of that layer, and inside that membership we want to put the backdrop, and we want to connect the backdrop into that layer. So we want to make sure that these are connected. So let's bring this together. So we can go select the object, right mouse click on the layer, and then we just add that selected object. And then we'll look at that membership again, and you see that the BG layer now has the backdrop added to it. So the default layer has the rest of the objects, and this one has the object added to it. So this now could be used to template or to create as a reference layer, and then we can't select it anymore, which is quite cool. So having the background layer now on its own layer has helped us with the selection process. What about though if we want to do something with the objects in our scene? Well, if we were to add the sun to its own layer in here, and we call this layer sun, and this sun layer is, let's give it a yellow color, and this means that the wireframes on this will go yellow, and we were to reference this out or template this out, this layer, so that there's the sun, and we add the objects to that layer, so there's the objects. You can see that all the objects that are connected underneath this chain are also going to inherit the layer. So that's not going to help us much if we're wanting to then work on any of the planet systems that are in here. We also might have problems if we were to animate the sun going in a different direction. Say this, we wanted the sun to rotate around the z-axis instead of the y-axis. The inherited properties through the outliner would be passed on to its children. So we need to come up with a bit of a solution. So let's take the sun layer out. So let's just right mouse click on here and remove the selected objects. These aren't part of this layer anymore. And let's also take the earth out of the sun's animation influence. So let's take it out. We still want to create a similar sort of animation. So we want to create the same animation on the sun, influencing the planetary systems, but we're going to do that by creating a group. So the easiest way to do this will be to create under the edit menu a group. So we'll just create a group, and the group will be made at world 0. So if I show you where the pivot point is by pressing the move transform tool, you can see that the pivot point is at 0. So this is exactly the same place that the sun's pivot point is. So under this group system now, I'm going to call this a G for group underscore planets, and underneath that we have our Earth and our Moon. So the hierarchy still looks the same, but we could now add the sun to its own layer. So we'll add this selected object and we create this as a template, but we can see that we can still select the planets that are underneath this group. So any of the animation that's on the sun, so the animation is on the Y keyframe here, we could copy these keyframes. So we just use the shift mouse, left mouse button, and we copy these keyframes, and we could apply those keyframes to the group underneath. And again, we will get into doing some of that grouping in there. We could also create a connection between channels as well, and again, when we get into animating objects, we can look at those in more detail. But this now shows us that the group system is doing the same job as we had before in a hierarchy system, but that we now have a bit more flexibility in creating separate layers. So we could now create a layer, but we could do this again and again for any of the layers, any of the objects that are in the scene. So it helps us to organize our scene, but it also helps us when we come to animating as well. Groups are very useful to have as an in-between layer for animated objects.